World Today weekend on CKNW News Talk 980. Once again, here's Sean Leslie.
Any day with Zeppelin is a good day. All right, Marc Emery, the so-called Prince of Pot, he's serving out his sentence in the United States for selling pot seeds into the United States. But now the U.S. government says he can be transferred back to a Canadian prison to serve out the rest of his term. You will hear from his wife, Jodie Emery, a pot activist herself, right now joined by John Conroy. Mr. Conroy is a lawyer in the Fraser Valley who's handled many cases in federal court regarding prisoners. He's the author of Canadian Prison Law. Mr. Conroy, hi, how are you?
Not bad, thank you.
So how would this work now? Is it up to the federal government to say, okay, Marc Emery, you can come home?
Well, it's governed by something called the International Transfer of Offenders Act, which was amended by this government not that long ago, and so presumably he's under the amended version. But essentially, all parties need to consent, which means the U.S., Marc Emery, and Canada. And so the first step, he's obviously applied. That application to the U.S. government has here been approved. His application, he presumably has one into the Canadian government, which is processed by the International Transfer Unit of the Correctional Service of Canada. And once this U.S. approval is through, then it's up to Canada and the Minister of Public Safety, who was Vic Toews until last week, and we'll presumably know on Monday, I hear the shuffle is to take place then, who the new minister is. And so if Canada approves him, then Marc will have to decide whether to accept the transfer to go through with it or not. And he'll have a number of factors to weigh in making that decision. I'm not completely sure, and Jodie will be able to enlighten us as to how much time he has left, remembering that in the U.S. system, if you're a foreigner, there are certain disadvantages, but you do get deported at around 85% of the sentence. And so if he serves out his U.S. sentence, he would be deported back to Canada, free and clear of any Canadian clutches by the Correctional Service of Canada or the Parole Board of Canada, and he would be free to carry on. He wouldn't be able to return to the U.S. without a waiver of inadmissibility, and his record would remain a U.S. record, accessible easily, but still not part of a Canadian criminal record. On the other hand, if he transfers or accepts the transfer and consents to the transfer, then he will ultimately end up at a jumping-off spot and probably bring him up the West Coast, and he will end up at Pacific Institution, the Regional Reception Center, where everybody who is sentenced to a federal sentence in B.C. goes in order to be classified and processed to determine whether you're maximum, medium, or minimum security and what institution you should be placed at. And in this whole process, Canada in particular will convert the U.S. sentence to a Canadian sentence and will establish various eligibility dates. And if Marc is passed, and I'm sure he is, this 1/3 date, which would be normally Canadian eligibility for parole,
right,
and that'll be 1/3 from the date of sentencing. He would then be, the paperwork will show that his eligibility dates are deemed to be the date of his transfer, so the date of arrival in Canada. And so he'll probably be past eligibility for day and full parole. But that doesn't mean you walk out. That means that you get to the reception center, they take 3 to 4 months to process you, do up all the paperwork on you, gather it from various places, and then ultimately submit your paperwork. Well, first of all, they'll classify you, and Marc should be classified at minimum security, particularly because of his offense, nature of his offense and his age, and then place him, and then submit the paperwork to the Parole Board of Canada, and they usually require 3 or 4 months lead time. And then he'd have to have a hearing because the feds abolished accelerated parole, which would normally apply to first-time federal offenders like Marc who have no history of violence. And so he has to apply, he has to convince the board, try and get first the support of his case management team, the caseworkers in the institution, and then convince the board that he's not an undue risk to reoffend, and that the grant of full parole in his case would aid his reformation and rehabilitation. The alternative is he sits in Canada until 2/3 of what's left from the date of arrival, and that's the statutory release date for somebody who comes up on a transfer, and then he'd be entitled to his release, but still under supervision until warrant expiry. So when you take a parole, you're on parole, subject to suspension, for a breach of a condition, in anticipation of a breach of a condition, or simply to protect society. So you're a puppet on a string until the end of your sentence. So critical to know how much time he has left and whether it's really worthwhile moving from probably a place where he knows everybody, is reasonably comfortable, and knows the basics and knows that he'll be kicked out free and clear at 85%, or do you want to come back and subject yourself to the vagaries of the Correctional Service of Canada's assessment process and probably be into a whole brand new situation for at least 3 or 4 months before hopefully seeing the light of day, but being on parole until warrant expiry.
Have you handled similar cases like this? Are there cases where Canadians in U.S. prisons just say, you know what, it's better to stay here and do that and not have to worry about the Correctional Service of Canada?
That's the way it's become, because
Really?
the Harper government has successfully turned the clock backwards on our correctional system, and it's now, in my opinion, almost as bad as what it used to be back in the 60s and 70s. And so American prisons, on the other hand, some of them have turned around and have got much better. The courts down there have ordered decarceration due to overcrowding and things like that. And so it's not always that advantageous to come back to a Canadian prison. It used to be, and the whole purpose, one must remember, is that ultimately a Canadian citizen who has a right to enter Canada under the Constitution and a right to remain and a right to leave, the Canadian citizen will ultimately be deported back to Canada. So he or she is coming back. And so the question is, what is in the Canadian public interest? So this statute, the earlier versions of it, were introduced as a humanitarian, progressive thing that was in the Canadian public interest, so that the Canadian incarcerated abroad comes back, is assessed by Canadian correctional officials. They get to know him over a period of time and to assess his risk to the public, to program him, and then to release him subject to conditions that protect the Canadian public, and as I've explained, subject to the parole process. If you come back on a deportation, you come back free and clear. And so if there's any concern about the person being a risk, the deportation is obviously not in the Canadian public interest the way a transfer would be.
All right. Well, Jodie Emery has been on the line listening. Of course, Jodie is Marc's wife. She's a political activist, public speaker, owner of Cannabis Culture Headquarters. Jodie, you've heard what John Conroy has to say. Your comments on this, do you think Marc really does want to come home, or is it better to serve out the rest of his time in the U.S.?
Well, Marc's kind of aware of a lot of those details, and it's been good to hear more of it. But we do know that that's the situation, coming home next July 9th, being kicked out of the U.S. then for 85% of the 5-year sentence for good behavior. That does sound preferable in many ways. However, Marc does want to get transferred, and we thought if we could get him transferred quickly, if we could get the signature pretty soon and get him home, somehow a lot of political pressure could perhaps expedite his application and his return home. But it is true that he could come home under Canadian supervision and with all these conditions, and could make life very difficult for him. Otherwise, he could be kicked out of the U.S. and not have any records. So he's aware, and it's always a bit of a gamble to decide what way to go. But that's the same as deciding what kind of plea deal to take and all those details. So it's never been easy.
Yeah.
But if Marc's going to continue to advocate for cannabis law reform and perhaps engage in civil disobedience in doing that, he will have a major problem here in Canada. So he's probably better off to wait until he's deported so that they do not have that kind of control over.
So he's free and clear, as you were saying. John Conroy, one last question. I'll let you go. And as you said, we do have some political uncertainty at the top right now in Ottawa. Hopefully that's cleared up next week. But it is still within the power of the Harper government, correct, to just say, forget it, we don't want to approve this transfer?
Oh, that's right. And most of the decisions, first by Stockwell Day when he was Minister of Public Safety, then Peter Van Loan, and certainly Vic Toews, were negative decisions compared to what used to occur before they became the government.
John Conroy,
they tried to punish Canadian citizens under the guise of public safety, which doesn't make any sense at all, because if they're coming into the clutches of our own correctional system, then any risk to public safety would be after that. But that's the line that they have taken, and they have been overturned in the federal court quite often. But if Marc's only got a year to go to 85%, certainly my recommendation to him would be not to bother. He'd be better off to flatten it out and get deported back.
John Conroy, thank you for your time. I'll ask Jodie Emery to stand by. What do you think? Do you think the Canadian government should say yes to this transfer? 604-280-9898. Should Marc Emery come home? Star 9898 on your cell phone. We'll be back with Jodie Emery. And